Hey everyone, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 120th episode of the Writ Podcast. On Monday, voters in the Ontario riding of Durham will be going to the polls for a federal by-election to fill the seat vacated by former Conservative leader Erin O'Toole. It'll be the culmination of what has been weeks and even months of preparing for this contest. So what actually goes into by-election campaigns? To explain the nuts and bolts of by-elections, I'm joined today by Melissa Cotton and Fred DeLorey. Fred is a former national campaign manager for the Conservative Party of Canada and was also director of political operations for former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's now host of the iPolitics podcast On Background with Fred DeLorey and partner at NorthStar Public Affairs. Before moving to the private sector, Melissa Cotton spent over 20 years as a volunteer and staffer for several provincial parties and the federal Liberals. She has managed or worked on multiple local election and by-election campaigns and served in several central campaign war rooms. Fred and Melissa, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
So I do want to take this step by step. So we're going to go into what goes behind preparing, running for a by-election. So we'll start at the very beginning. In this case in Durham, everybody knew that eventually Erin O'Toole was probably going to step aside, that the seat would be vacated, but he didn't make it official. So what happens when everybody kind of knows this riding is going to have a by-election, but they can't get anything officially started? Fred, why don't you kick us off?
Well, the party can always start, right? When it's very clear that when someone indicates, and he would have told the leadership of the party that he was leaving, so they would have started their process for looking for a candidate. And that would be, recruitment, but also just opening up the actual official process. So the National Council would have to inform the members that the nomination period has begun and give an X amount of weeks for people to submit packages and sell memberships to do so.
Melissa, do people start, sniffing around for a candidate? How do you do it without insulting, I guess, the local MP as well?
Yeah, I think it's like in this case, it's different because you're looking at it from the opposition. It's not a held riding. And so you've got folks that are saying, this has maybe been held for X amount of years. I've been active in this community and I'm interested perhaps in getting involved in this riding and I wanted to run, and perhaps have even been setting themselves up through their community involvement or the things that they've been doing and the contacts that they've even been kind of curating for themselves. So, I think that people start to do that as well. And you've seen that in lots of other examples lately too, where they're kind of spending their time making decisions about whether this is the right timing for them to get active in different things, to look at different career choices. So absolutely.
Just on that point, I actually received a text from someone via LinkedIn or a message in Durham, wondering if I could give them some advice on running for the Conservative nomination. And of course, that's the Liberal candidate right now, who's up with the other party. But certainly people reach out and try to see if there's a fit for them.
So that's a nice little point. Okay, so when the MP actually resigns, so things are getting started, there's an official vacancy. Melissa, what are the first steps once that becomes official and you can get, the nomination battles officially underway?
Yeah, so I think it somewhat depends on the dynamic of the riding. There are some ridings that has been held by your party for a long time, and so it feels like it's a little bit more intuitive what's going to happen next in terms of potentially holding the riding. But there's a lot of dynamics at play. When you've had a riding that's been held by one party for a long time, you want to take a look at it if you're not the incumbent seat, and look at it and say, is this something we can pick up? What are our chances here in kind of doing some of that kind of work? But getting those nominations in, making sure you're curating that right candidate. There's so many different dynamics when it comes to a by-election in terms of the tone it sets. It depends where you are in the electoral cycle and what that's going to say to folks, whether you win it, lose it, the margins, all those good things. So start to look at what that candidate, who that candidate should be. Start the process in terms of courting perhaps candidates or working through the process for those if it's going to be a really contentious nomination meeting, and because it's a place that parties can really find themselves divided, and it's not a good place to start when you're starting a by-election if you've had a really factitious nomination, I guess is the best way to put that.
Fred, so the MP resigns. How does the machinery get started?
Well, again, I think in this instance, we quite knew what was happening with Mr. O'Toole. He'd made it very clear he was leaving soon. even before then. But generally, it's, once an MP's leaving or once they resign, you start the nomination process, and then it's almost a waiting period too for when the actual election is going to be called, because it's the government's call. The Prime Minister can call it within a 6-month time period after I believe the Speaker's been informed of the vacancy, or the CEO, the Chief Electoral Officer. So sometimes it's a mad scramble, right? Like if the Prime Minister was to call a by-election immediately, we may not have our candidate in place yet. And then we have to shorten our timelines and appoint at some time just appoint a candidate. But if that's one of the things that makes it challenging, because we could be in the middle of a hot process like Melissa described, where there's a lot of internal battling, selling memberships, doing all that, and by-elections actually called the actual election, which really complicates matters and makes it difficult at times to organize that. So once that 6-month window is so large that it does get tricky at times. And I know there's been some, I think you may have written on this, Eric, about shortening up that time, a by-election period, because it does give the government such a strong advantage.
Well, Fred, you bring up an interesting point there. So how does the planning differ if you're the governing party and you can set the date? How early do you have that date set in your mind? And if you're the opposition party, do you have to be ready right away, or can you wait a little while? How does that work out?
Opposition, you have to be ready right away. You don't have any luxury there. When you're in government, you obviously have that ability to map it out how you want it. What are the issues? Is it going to be around the budget? Is it going to be a time where you have an issue that you could try to sell to that electorate to help win that seat or keep that seat? There's also the impact of other by-elections, right? We're talking 1 seat right now. Last spring, there was 4. And when you can package 4 or more ridings together, you can do a lot of different things in those elections, because the rules are different, the financial rules. In each by-election, there's a local campaign budget. There's also a federal campaign budget that the national party can spend however it wants in that by-election. But if there's 4 by-election, or more than 1 by-election, there's 2 or whatever, the federal party gets more money. They can still spend it wherever they want. So they could spend, theoretically, if there's 4 by-elections, they could spend all their federal cap in 1 riding, and if that's a significant riding they're trying to pick up. So the federal, when you're the government, you could look around and try to predict if there's going to be other by-elections happening where you could pool these together. So that's another advantage that the government would have.
Yeah, right now, when the by-election was called, Toronto St. Paul's was officially vacant. And there was news this week that Daniel Blakey is going to be stepping aside at the end of March. So there will be 3 vacancies, because David Lametti's riding in Montreal is also vacant. So yeah, they can pool those 3 together later this year. Melissa, when it's a by-election, I know there's a big difference between the importance of the candidate. So when it is a by-election, how much consideration goes into who that candidate's going to be, whether it's going to be someone who's just a local candidate, wins a local nomination, a star that is recruited? How important are those factors in trying to choose a candidate for a by-election versus a general election?
I think really, actually, my answer wouldn't change between the two, to be honest with you, except that in a by-election, there's a little bit more, I would say, a little bit more media attention on that person. So you want to make sure that it's going to be somebody you're happy to have in the spotlight. But really, I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that. I think it depends on the riding. I think there's a lot of dynamics at play that are, you want to have, obviously, we think all candidates are star candidates, but exactly what you're getting at, Eric, and like some are maybe more high-profile than others when they start the campaign, and even when they end the campaign, I guess. So I think that there is that impact. You want to look at that, but I don't think you can have a one-size-fits-all answer to that, because it's really going to depend on the dynamics. It's going to depend on potentially, if you're not it's not a held seat. If you think you can pick it up, and maybe there is somebody. Often by-elections are looked at as the place that, if you have a newly elected leader, perhaps, or you have sort of a quote-unquote star that has expressed an interest, and maybe it's not their home riding, but there's a way that you could sort of sell that person in that riding. Often we could slot them in there, but I think the dynamics are different for each riding, to be honest, in each by-election. There are some that parties are going to look at it and say, this is one that we can absolutely pick up, or we need to hold this, because the tone and the message is really a big thing in by-elections too. A lot of people believe that it sort of sets the tone for how people feel about the governing party, how they feel perhaps about a party that might have a new leader or anything like that. So there's a lot of dynamics, but it's not by any means one size fits all.
Fred, what's your view on that, the importance of a candidate in general versus a by-election?
I'll agree with much of what Melissa said, but I'll be a bit more blunt and say candidates don't matter. It's all about the leader and the party brand that carries this. There are, I think I've been involved in over 50 by-elections at the federal and provincial level. And I can recall one truly star candidate, and that was Julian Fantino, when he ran for us in 2010, I think it was. That was the one time where I felt there was a candidate that really changed the game. The rest, their job is to amplify the message. And there are good candidates who do that and do that better than others. But their actual name recognition, people's name recognition is not nearly as high as they think it is. And it's really the party brand. And their ability to push that message, though, and to sell the message of the party is what makes them a good candidate or not.
Okay, so there's a by-election happening. What's the role that the central party plays in a by-election? I know it'll depend on whether it's a winnable riding versus a not winnable riding. Fred, why don't you start first? So in terms of resourcing, whether there's decisions to send staff, whether there's the messaging that is directed from the central party, how central is the central party to a by-election?
It's very central. It's very heavily involved. Because it's the only election in town, and we have this political machinery that is designed for elections and fighting elections. So it's an opportunity to put your people in there, winnable or not. You can put resources. Now, if it's one riding on its own, a standalone riding, you could certainly put the resources in and should. Volunteers from neighboring ridings that could pop in as well, but also your central staff, and helps the local campaign team. Basically, you assign the campaign manager as well. You're much more involved than you would be in a next election, because there's 343 seats, and you just don't have that level of to get to. But with the 1 or 4 seats, you can do that, and you are heavily involved, and you make sure you approve all of the literature they do, all of the communications, make sure they're lockstep with what the leader's doing. So it is, there's a heavy hand from the federal party during by-elections, and that should be for all parties. And it's not a criticism. That's just, we're political machineries that should be doing this.
Melissa, what's your view on that? How central the central campaign has to be in a by-election?
Yeah, I agree. Has to be and is are maybe two different conversations there. I fully agree with Fred that it is an opportunity for parties to, give some training, in fact, to staff that perhaps maybe haven't played certain roles, or you want to test them out to see if this might be the right fit for them during a general, but also to test whether it's new technologies or new theories on campaigning. It's a bit of an interesting test ground on whether you feel like you're going into it that this is a surefire win for you, or the exact opposite. It's just an opportunity, and it's a sort of a small microcosm that you can test some of these theories out that you don't have in between set election dates, really. Yeah, well, I fully agree.
Melissa, how does it differ? Like you said, like depending on like the profile of the riding. If you think about the ridings that are coming up in a couple of months, the Liberals obviously would have put a lot of effort into a riding like Toronto St. Paul's. The Conservatives probably not sending one a lot of effort in downtown Montreal. So how does that differ when the central campaign is looking at a riding where the party might get 5 or 10% versus one where they might actually win it?
I think it sort of depends on, like you say, if they're grouped together or it's a standalone. When it's a standalone, I don't believe it necessarily changed. And I've been the campaign manager in those campaigns where you go, I feel like this may or may not be our shot here. You always go into it thinking you're going to win, and you tell the team that, but behind the scenes, you're like, I've seen the data. I'm fully aware this is not going to happen. It's a good opportunity to try those things anyways. When it's not a standalone, though, when you've grouped several together, to Fred's point, you can make some decisions about where you put those resourcing, both people and money and all those different things. But yeah, I think that it doesn't really change it that much for me in some respects overall, because you can really test some different theories, and you can make sure that you kind of like know what you're doing and you're trying some things. But there is some unique dynamics too, I would say, particularly with the campaigns that you talk about coming up. You've got some ridings where you've had some folks that have held those ridings, particularly St. Paul's, with Canada having held that riding for a long time. think the dynamics can shift. And you've had the same campaign team and the same riding association for a very long time that were rallying around someone in particular. So it's another opportunity in some of those ridings in a by-election to test some new ways of doing things. Not just things that the party would have wanted to test, but just specific to that riding, to really get a better feel as you go into a general after the next by-election to say, like, is this still the formula that works to hold this riding?
Fred, is there going to be a difference for the Conservatives, for example, in how they're going to handle Durham, where they're the incumbent, they should be able to win it, how they'll handle Elmwood, Transcona, and Toronto St. Paul's, where they're the underdog, but they could win them, and then La Salle-Mont, where there's zero chance that they're going to win it?
Right. So I would say in the case of Durham, like it's a standalone, they'll go full tilt. I saw Jenny Byrne, who's going to be running the next campaign. She's there, knocking on doors and bringing teams out to do it. And that's exactly the message they should be sending and doing that, regardless if it's like Janelle's going to win by a massive number, but you still go full tilt. You don't leave anything on the table. Those by-elections coming up are going to be very interesting. Elmwood, Transcona, particularly. That's a riding where the Conservatives can pick up. They targeted hard the last number of elections and have come very, very close. We've held it previously, not that long ago. So that's going to be the real first battleground, I think, that we've seen in a while between Conservatives and another party that they can peel off from the Progressive Coalition or whatever, the SACA Coalition, whatever we're calling that group, which I think will send a message to the NDP and the Liberals as well, how vulnerable they could be now. But with that, to your question, I would say, you're right. They may not be putting a lot of money into the Montreal seat. They'll put that into Elmwood, Transcona, and we'll see St. Paul's. I'm hearing things are actually looking up there for the Conservatives, but I don't know what that means. We last won that in the 80s. So it's still a steep hill to climb, but I'm sure they're going to be keeping a close eye, because if they peel that one off, that would be remarkable. But it's possible. So I would say those are the two ridings they're looking at. But at the same time, there's the Quebec volunteer base that they're growing and is getting stronger. And they could be really focusing those folks into the Montreal seat. So may not be putting money into that seat, but they may still be putting human resources into it.
We're talking about the involvement of the central campaign. Melissa, do the locals, do they like that? Do they bristle at that involvement from the central party?
I think the fact that both Fred and I correct on that one tells you usually not. My experience has been mixed on that. And I've been the person that was close enough to be considered local in a by-election, and I've seen the central folks come in, and you go, okay. I think sometimes there's a pushback, because particularly in a riding where it's maybe been a held one for a long time, the notion is we know how to win this riding. We've been doing it forever. Far be it for you to come in and tell me. But I've also been in the other seat where I've been that sort of central person that was sent in to do the thing and to test the theories. You do often get a lot of pushback. It's not really well accepted, but there are folks that, I think any campaign and any local or riding association has that sort of older guard that's been there for a long time, and we really appreciate and value that experience. And then hopefully you're renewing it by bringing in new folks. And so sometimes it's those newer folks that are more apt to enjoy the exposure to the central campaign team and the work that they do. But, to your point of somebody like Jenny being out in Durham, like she absolutely should be. And I'm not surprised to hear that, because that's where you also find some of those really amazing rising stars that you want to pluck out of some of those smaller centers and bring them into your central team and to find that new talent. So I think that's absolutely accurate as well, that you need to have that central exposure to make sure that you're kind of continuing to grow the next generation too.
Fred, I'm sure the Conservative grassroots very open to people from, Ottawa, Toronto coming in, telling them how to run things.
It's a mix. It's certainly a mix. I'd say most part it's positive, though. Some people bristle with it. Some people think they know their riding is different, that we don't understand it. But all 343 ridings are pretty well the same in terms of how the mechanics work. And that's what the central party brings to the table, is understanding how you drive that vote out and get them to vote. And again, by-elections, they don't have the national story, so sometimes it's harder to do that. But at the same point, what Melissa said, you also do find those great people out there that it's a great way to build long-term relationships. And Melissa also made a point earlier about the experimenting and the training and stuff that goes on. It made me think back to the 2009 by-election in Nova Scotia for Scott Armstrong and Cumberland Colchester. In the Maritimes, there was a tradition of not door knocking within the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party really built up a strong door knocking and ground game program across the country, not in the Maritimes. And we had very few seats at this point, despite being in government there. And I remember that by-election, Jenny really, really pushed hard to knock on doors. We made our candidate, Scott Armstrong, work it hard. And it really changed the political culture there. And we went into that by-election trailing. We weren't, the Liberals were leading at the time, and we were able to, if you recall, that was Bill Casey's old seat, so we weren't very popular there. We won that seat, and it was the ground game that won it for us. And Scott became a champion for that, and that cause, Scott Armstrong did, and really helped transform the political culture in the Maritimes for the Conservative Party to become very heavy on door knocking. So it really shifted. And in 2011, we won the majority of seats in the Maritimes for the first time in decades.
Okay, so you're talking about door knocking, that kind of thing. Melissa, the by-election started, it's campaign, you have the date, you got 5-6 weeks. What's the day-to-day of a by-election campaign?
It's often not that different than your average writ, your regular election campaign, but it is. It's like doing that work back, taking your calendar and looking, okay, this is election day, this is where advance polls are going to be, and what do I need to accomplish every day along that path? I think sometimes you get a little bit less wrapped up in having to set aside time for, say, leaders debates and those kind of things that often happen during a general election that can really take your volunteers off track a bit, by wanting to have debate watch parties and those kind of things, which are, can be good for morale, but take people off the doorsteps. So as a campaign manager, those are kind of your nightmare days because they're a bit of a write-off and your data is not going to be good that day. So I think you kind of can focus on a little bit more every day to day, just pulling those votes and how to do it. I think to the points that we've made prior, though, in terms of trying new technologies, trying new things, you do have to kind of take those into account. What have we not normally done that we have to sort of build into our plan? And you might not even be familiar with it. As the campaign team, it's perhaps something that Central has put on to you and said, we've not done this before. Let's test this out. And I, as a campaign manager in the past, have had to sort of build in a little bit of a buffer to allow for the trial and error, as it were, because it's untested. So it might not mean that it's actually easily used or, you can implement it quickly. So just building that in. But otherwise, for the most part, for me in the past, it's pretty much just been the same kind of plug and play calendar that I can use as a campaign manager in any way.
Fred, what's the week to week, and that's an interesting point. Less perhaps distraction from a national campaign. There's no leaders tour coming through. There's less media interest in whatever the story is. But I guess local media might be a little bit more involved if that still exists anymore, where the riding is. Right. But Fred, what's that day to day like?
Yeah, usually in the media in a by-election, they cover it the first day and the last day, and everything in between is dark. And the candidate and her team should just be out knocking on doors hard, IDing vote. That's where we put the focus on, and build the team and bring in volunteers from other ridings where you can. And just it's very simplistic in many ways, but it's the most effective way to do it. And we do try out new technology. We have different, we've been using Sims for decades now, and we developed Sims to Go a decade ago, which is a mobile app of that, and we had to try that out in by-elections before we could really gear that up for a general election. I'm not familiar if they're using new software now, the Conservatives, where they are on that. But hopefully they are, and this would be the time to try that out. But again, the real focus, the candidate should be knocking on doors all day long with his or her team.
Okay, so the doors are being knocked on. The advance polling comes in. Apparently the advance poll turnout in the Durham was around 10%, I think I saw, because they updated some of their numbers. Not a huge amount, but Fred, is there any importance or special importance on advance voting in a by-election versus general, or is it the same?
You still go full tilt and try to get everyone to vote as soon as humanly possible. Don't leave anything on the table, because something can happen between now and election day, and you just don't want to be left out on that. So it's always the focus, drive people to vote, either at the returning office or advance polls, wherever they can do it.
Melissa, the advanced poll versus during a general election, but also just the notion that you are driving people to the polls. These are small numbers, right, of individuals that you're actually getting to vote. How impactful can that be, especially in by-election where turnout is low?
Yeah, I mean, every vote counts, right? So every vote that you get in that ballot box before election day is one less person that you have to pull, and the opportunity to try and identify more voters that are going to swing your way. But to Fred's point, I mean, look at the weather here in Ottawa yesterday. I almost blew away getting into my car. If I was a voter on election night, I might go, to heck with that, I'm not leaving the house. So you never want to leave anything to chance. And that's just, the acts of God, as they say. That's not a policy shift or something that happens, or, you get some great opposition research, because from an oppo research point of view, really when you want to drop that kind of thing that you've got is either after advanced polls or after the opportunity to take your candidates in the ballot, which is a really prime time to do that. So anything you can get into the ballot box on advanced polls is golden. And you don't want to miss those opportunities, honestly.
Yeah. Fred, Melissa just brought that up, and it just made me think about it. Oppo research, it's always a huge story in a general election. In the first 2 weeks, it's, which candidates can you force the other party to get rid of. You don't really see a lot of Oppo research in by-elections. Is it just because of the lower number of candidates, or is there anything different about it?
Well, I mean, the Oppo research, it's exactly that. It's, when you have 343 candidates, you're going to have 5 or 10 candidates that have said something stupid. But when there's just 1 or 2 by-elections, hopefully that candidate's been really vetted well. As Melissa mentioned at the very beginning about how important it is for by-elections, that's one of the things to do, is make sure they don't have anything in their background that could hurt the party. So no, you really don't see it as much. Again, back to the 2009 by-election, it made me think. Michael Ignatieff, when he was leader, went to the riding, and he was asked by a local journalist about long gun registry, and it was there where he said that he fully supports the long gun registry, which in rural Canada was obviously very, very unpopular. And we got that recording. We had someone attend his event, and we were able to blast that around the country and make radio ads out of it. So there's lots of things that you can pick up during these by-elections as well, from different things that people say that they may not think was being recorded. But yeah, it is harder to drop it on candidates though in a by-election.
Okay, so it's by-election day, and I'm sure it's very similar to in election day, but I'd still like to hear sort of the blow-by-blow of those once the polls open on election day. Melissa, what is election day like?
Yeah, so it's almost like any other general election day, other than you're not getting caught up in sort of that national perspective. But if you've done your job right as a campaign manager, you've put in place a really good election day chair who's taken over from you as the campaign manager. Election day, I'm always busy, but because I need to make myself busy, otherwise I'll go nuts. But I like to pull vote. So I think it's similar in our case. We often will have what's known as home centers, where you've divided up the riding and by the amount of votes that you have in each sort of polling area. And you've got volunteers out on the doors. They're knocking on those doors. They're calling people. They're doing anything they can to get people out to the polls, and making sure that things are going right. You're ensuring that all the polls have actually opened on time. But sometimes by-elections are not just a test case for parties, but also for Elections Canada, or elections whatever province you're in, because they often are testing some new things too, and that can come with a little bit of speed bumps. So you're making sure that that's going right, and then you're just making sure that your candidate's ready for whatever that night is going to bring, and that you're ready to give that speech and to continue to give that vote of confidence to your volunteers, because some of those people aren't just from that riding; they've come in from places, and then it sets a bit of a tone for the party in general to kind of give your volunteers a little bit of a rah-rah either direction, however that night goes for you.
Fred, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it usually starts a few days before in terms of really activating, right, the get out the vote machine. Election days are Mondays in Canada, so Saturdays and Sundays you plaster the riding with reminders to your ID'd vote. At this stage of the campaign, you are only talking to people you've identified that are voting for you. You're not talking to anyone else, unless it's super tight and you're still in the weird persuasion phase, but that's couple days out, you should be done that. So you'll plaster the riding with volunteers to put door knockers on doors or sticky notes or whatever, reminding them when and where to vote. On election day, you hit those doors again. And then you have teams going to the polling or the returning office and getting updates on who voted. Now Elections Canada, that's constantly being changed and rigged around how that happens. Sometimes I know in some jurisdictions we just get updates from the party centrally or from Elections Canada or Elections Authority and don't have to have runners, but sometimes we have to send runners in to collect the data and then upload it to our system, and then we knock off those names and don't bother those people anymore and just keep going, and you just keep calling and knocking on doors, doing several rounds if you have to throughout neighborhoods until the polls close.
We don't often talk about this, but I'm curious to hear, Melissa, the day after the by-election, the day after the election, locally, what's happening?
It very much depends on what happened the night before, but really, like, you want to make sure that you've taken into account all those folks that came out to volunteer. You're doing what you need to do to clean up the campaign office and making sure you're collecting your signs, particularly if you're going to have that candidate run again, because those are gold. You don't lose those. But yeah, I mean, if you won, it's a whole different conversation, because you're walking somebody through the process, and whether you're actually going to be the one that is working for them, on the Hill or in their legislature, wherever. You're really the first line of defense, and they have so many questions, and their families have a lot of questions too. So you're walking them through that process. You're connecting with Ottawa or wherever your provincial capital is to say, okay, how do we want to start onboarding this person and looking at what's next for them? But just the logistics becomes a big piece of it if you've won it. If you've lost, again, it's making sure that you've got enough people around that are so motivated to take everything down and to thank those volunteers, because win or lose, they're the ones that were there every day. So yeah, it's just the usual things that you would have on any regular campaign. Other than on a by-election, you're also doing that, a little bit of a debrief on how did those new technologies work, or those new practices and theories that we used, and having to spend a bit more time maybe kind of downloading that to folks.
Yeah, Fred, how would that debrief work centrally at the central HQ?
Yeah, well, you would check and see how many people you're able to ID, how many actually got out to vote. So what was your success rate right there, and dragging them out, because that's your primary way to campaign, is to drag them out. And you just look at the poll changes and the demographics and who came out based on what you can tell on neighborhoods and whatnot. By-elections are incredibly important in really understanding where things are. You can read so much more into them than I think polls give you, because this is actually people came out to a ballot box to mark an X for a candidate. It's not like just answering a phone or taking an online survey. They actually went out and did something. So you get a better indicator. So debriefs are incredibly important to see what worked locally, and what the national team could learn from that, and what they can then apply to other areas in future campaigns.
I think there's an important piece there.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Eric.
Yeah.
I think there's an important piece of that though too, right? Because that debrief is so important in those by-elections, because that team and that candidate are not necessarily going to have the same power, or the same people in general when it comes to the general election. So you need to make sure that you've set them up to have a good experience in the next election, because there's frequently, we'll see, folks that won in a by-election have a harder time sometimes getting themselves going in a general election, because their first campaign experience was this huge group of people that swarm in and do the things for them, and they maybe hadn't had the opportunity to build up that local team as much. So to Fred's point, that debrief is extremely important and sets them up to continue to hold that riding in the next general.
We can finish on this, because I'm getting, from both of you, how important by-elections are as sort of test cases for parties, and they can test out new messaging, new technologies, and they can read into the data. There is a tendency in the media to be dismissive of by-elections, which I'm never one who does that. And parties obviously are going to spin them based on with the results. If they won, they are signifying everything. If they lost, they are meaningless. But Fred, how much do parties actually care about, whether they'll admit it or not, how much do they care about by-elections?
They care very much, and should. as you're right. A lot of media and a lot of pundits and a lot of folks like Melissa and I who go on panels will say they don't matter. They'll spin it. They matter big. Look at the last by-election round. We had those four. The Conservatives lost ground in three of them, despite having significant lead in the polls. And there were issues with the party and the brand and the leader. And they spent several months retooling and rebranding the leader, I believe, as an outcome of those by-election results. And then we're seeing how things are going now. So this by-election, I am predicting a very, very big win. I think we're going to see that what they've done over the last, 8-10 months since those by-elections is working. And again, there were red flags in the last by-elections, and they've learned from it, and I believe they've applied those lessons. Melissa,
I'm guessing you're going to echo that these are a lot more important than maybe we give them credit for.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, just to sort of build on some of the things Fred has said too, for all those new technologies and new techniques that we've been trying, it can really actually be vindicating for folks at Central that have said, I put stock and said this is the best way to do things. But it can also go the opposite way, that it'll prove that it wasn't the right theory and they have to retool. And depends on what the time gap is between a by-election and a general. It can really send people in a bit of a tailspin to make sure you rectify what you thought, what your theory and your hypothesis on what was going to work and how it was going to play out actually didn't, and how you're going to fix that before a general.
All right. Well, the results are on Monday in Durham, and we're all going to dissect the numbers. But clearly, there's a lot more going on under the surface that the parties are going to be spending some time on for the next little while. So appreciate both of you explaining that, because it's something that I think is really interesting, but we don't really talk about enough. Is that these are not just numbers and just ups and downs. There's lots going on there. So I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.